The luxury trap. The rise of farming was very gradual affair spreading over centuries and millennia. A band of Homo sapiens gathering mushrooms and nuts and hunting deer and rabbit did not all of a sudden settle in a permanent village, ploughing fields, sowing wheat, and carrying water from the river. The change proceeded by stages, each of which involved just a small alteration in daily life. Homo sapiens reached the Middle East around 70,000 years ago. For the next 50,000 years, our ancestors flourished there without agriculture. The natural resources of the area were enough to support its human population. In the times of plenty, people had a few more children, and in times of need, a few less. Humans, like many mammals, have hormonal and genetic mechanisms that helped control procreation. In good times, females reach puberty earlier, and their chances of getting pregnant are a bit higher. In bad times, puberty is late and fertility decreases. To these natural population controls were added cultural mechanisms. Babies and small children who move slowly and demand much attention were a burden on nomadic foragers. People tried to space their children around the clock, and until a late age around the clock, suckling significantly decreases the chances of getting pregnant. Other methods included full or partial sexual abstinence, backed perhaps by cultural taboos, abortions, and occasionally infanticide. During these long millennia, people occasionally ate wheat grain, but this was a marginal part of their diet. About 18,000 years ago, the last ice age gave way to a period of global warming. As temperatures rose, so did rainfall. The new climate was ideal for Middle Eastern wheat and other cereals, which multiplied and spread. People began eating more wheat, and in exchange, they inadvertently spread its growth. Since it was impossible to eat wild grains without first winnowing, grinding, and cooking them, people who gathered these grains carried them back to their temporary campsites for processing. Wheat grains are small and numerous, so some of them inevitably fell on the way to the campsite and were lost. Over time, more and more wheat grew along favorite human trails and near campsites. When human burned down forest and thickets, this also helped wheat. Fire cleared away trees and shrubs, allowing wheat and other grasses to monopolize the sunlight, water, and nutrients. Where wheat became particularly abundant, and game and other food sources were also plentiful, human bands could gradually give up their nomadic lifestyle and settle down in seasonal and even permanent camps. At first, they might have camped for 4 weeks during the harvest. A generation later, as wheat plants multiplied and spread, the harvest camp might have lasted for 5 weeks and then six, and finally it became a permanent village. Evidence of such settlements has been discovered throughout the Middle East, particularly in the Levant, where the Nautifian culture flourished from 12,500 BC to 9,500 BC. The Nautifians were hunter gatherers who subsisted on dozens of wild species, but they lived in permanent villages and devoted much of their time to the intensive gathering and processing of wild cereals. They built stone houses and granaries. They stored grain for times of need. They invented new tools such as stones, scythes for harvesting wild wheat, and stone pestles and mortars to grind it. In the years following 9500 BC, the descendants of the Natufians continued to gather and process cereals, but they also began to cultivate them in more and more elaborate ways. When gathering wild grains, they took care to lay aside part of the harvest to sow the fields next season. They discovered that they could achieve much better results by sowing grains deep in the ground rather than haphazardly scattering them on the surface. So they began to hoe and plow. Gradually, they also started to weed the fields to guard them against parasites and to water and fertilize them. As more effort was directed towards cereal cultivation, there was less time to gather and hunt wild species. The foragers became farmers. No single step separated the woman gathering wild wheat from the woman farming domesticated wheat. So it's hard to say exactly when the decisive transition to agriculture took place. But by 8500 BC, the Middle East was peppered with permanent villages such as Jericho, whose inhabitants spent most of their time cultivating a few domesticated species. With the move to permanent villages and the increase in food supply, the population began to grow. Giving up the nomadic lifestyle enabled women to have a child every year. Babies were weaned at an earlier age. They could be fed on porridge and gruel. The extra hands were solely needed in the fields, but the extra mouth quickly wiped out of the surpluses. So even more fields had to be planted. As people began living in disease-ridden settlements, children as children fed more on cereals and less on mother's milk, and as each child competed for his or her porridge with more and more siblings, child mortality soared. In most agricultural societies, at least one out of every three children died before reaching 20. Yet the increase in births still outpaced the increase in deaths. Humans kept having larger numbers of children. With time, the wheat bargain became more and more burdensome. Children died in droves, and adults ate bread by the swear of their brows. The average person in Jericho of 8500 BC lived a harder life than the average person in Jericho of 9500 BC or 13,000 BC. But nobody realized what was happening. Every generation continued to live like the previous generation, making only small improvements here and there in the way things were done. Paradoxically, a series of improvements, each of which was meant to make life easier, added up to a milestone around the necks of these farmers. Why did people make such a faithful miscalculation? For the same reason that people throughout history have miscalculated. People were unable to fathom the full consequences of their decisions. Whenever they decided to do a bit of extra work, say to hoe the fields instead of scattering seeds on the surface, people thought, yes, we will have to work hard, but the harvest will be so bountiful. We won't have to worry anymore about lean ears. Our children will never go to sleep hungry. It made sense. If you worked harder, you would have a better life. That was the plan. The first part of the plan went smoothly. People indeed worked harder, but people did not foresee that the number of children would increase, meaning that the extra wheat would have to be shared between more children. Neither did the early farmer understand that feeding children with more porridge and less breast milk would weaken their immune system, and that permanent settlements would be hotbeds for infectious diseases. They did not foresee that by increasing their dependence on a single source of food, they were actually exposing themselves even more to the depredations of drought. Nor did the farmers foresee that in good years their bulging granaries would tempt thieves and enemies, compelling them to start building walls and doing guard duty. Then why didn't human abandon farming when the plan backfired? Partly because it took generations for the small changes to accumulate and transform society, and by then nobody remembered that they had ever lived differently, and partly because population growth burned humanity's boats. If the adoption of plugging increased a village's population from 100 to 110, which then people would have volunteered to starve so that the others could go back to the good old times. There was no going back. The strap snapped shut. The pursuit of an easier life resulted in much hardship, and not for the last time. It happens to us today. How many young college graduates have taken demanding jobs in high powered family firms, vowing that they will work hard to earn money that will enable them to retire and pursue their real interests when they are 35, but by the time they reach that age they have large mortgages, children to school, houses in suburbs that necessitate at least two cars per family, and a sense that life is not worth living without really to do go back to digging up roots. No, they double their efforts and keep slaving away. One of history's few iron laws is that luxuries tend to become necessities and to spawn new obligations. Once people get used to certain luxury, they take it for granted. Then they begin to count on it. Finally, they reach a point where they can't live without it. Let's take another familiar example from our own time. Over the last few decades, we have invented countless time saving devices that are supposed to make life more relaxed. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, dishwashers, telephones, mobile phones, computers, emails. Previously, it took a lot of work to write a letter, address, and stamp an envelope and take it to the mailbox. It took days or weeks, maybe even months to get a reply. Nowadays, I can dash off an email, send it halfway around the globe, and if my addressee is online, receive a reply in a minute later. I have saved all that trouble and time, but do I live a more relaxed life? Sadly, not. Back in the snail mail era, people usually only wrote letters when they had something important to relate. Rather than writing the first thing that came into their head, they considered carefully what they wanted to say and how to phrase it. They expected to receive a similarly considered answer. Most people wrote and received no more than a handful of letters a month and seldom felt compelled to reply immediately. Today I receive dozens of emails each day, all from people who expect a prompt reply. We thought we were saving time. Instead, we revved up the treadmill of life to 10 times its former speed and made our days more anxious and agitated. Here and there, a Luddite holdout refuses to open an email account, just as thousands of years ago some human bands refused to take up farming and so escaped the luxury trap. But the agricultural revolution didn't need every band in a given region to join up. It only took one. Once one band settled down and started tilling, whether in the Middle East or Central America, agriculture was irresistible. Since farming created the conditions for swift demographic growth, farmers could usually overcome foragers by sheer weight of numbers. The foragers could either run away, abandoning their hunting grounds to field and pasture, so take up the plow, share themselves. Either way, the old life was doomed. The story of the luxury trap carries with it an important lesson. Humanity's search for an easier life released immense force of change that transformed the world into ways nobody envisioned or wanted. Nobody plotted the agricultural revolution or sought human dependence on cereal cultivation, a series of trivial decisions aimed mostly at filling few stomachs and gaining a little security had the cumulative effect of forcing ancient foragers to spend their days carrying water buckets under a scorching sun. Divine intervention. The above scenario explains the agricultural revolution as a miscalculation. It is very It's very plausible. History is full of far more idiotic calculations. But there's another possibility. Maybe it wasn't the search for an easier life that brought about the transformation. Maybe sapiens had other aspirations and were consciously willing to make their lives harder in order to achieve them. Scientists usually seek to attribute historical developments to cold economic and demographic factors. It sits better with their rational and mathematical methods. In the case of modern history, scholars cannot avoid taking into account non material factors such as ideology and culture. The written evidence forces their hand. We have enough documents, letters, and memoirs to prove that the Second World War was not caused by food shortages or demographic pressures. But we have no documents from the Notifian culture. So when dealing with ancient periods, the materialist school reigns supreme. It is difficult to prove that pre-literature people were motivated by faith rather than economic necessity. Yet in some rare cases, we are lucky enough to find telltale clues. In 1995, archaeologists began to excavate a site in southeast Turkey called Köpekli Tepe. In the oldest stratum, they discovered no signs of settlements, houses, or daily activities. They did, however, find monumental pillared structures decorated with spectacular engravings. Each stone pillar weighed up to 7 tons and reached a height of 5 meters. In a nearby quarry, they found a half chiseled pillar weighing 50 tons. Altogether, they uncovered more than 10 monumental structures, the largest of them nearly 30 meters across. Archaeologists are familiar with such monumental structures from sites around the world. The best known example is Stonehenge in Britain. Yet, as they studied Göbekli Tepe, they discovered an amazing fact. Stonehenge dates to 2500 BC and was built by a developed agricultural society. The structures at Göbekli Tepe are dated to about 9500 BC, and all available evidences indicates that they were built by hunter gatherers. The archaeological community initially found it difficult to credit these findings, but one test after another confirmed about the early date of structure and the pre-agricultural society of their builders. The capabilities of ancient foragers and the complexity of their culture seem to be far more impressive than was previously suspected. Why would a foraging society build such structures? They had no obvious utilitarian purpose. They were neither mammoth slaughterhouses nor places to shelter from rain or hide from lions. That leaves us with the theory that they were built for some mysterious cultural purpose that archaeologists have a hard time deciphering. Whatever it was, the foragers thought it worth a huge amount of effort and time. The only way to build Gobekli Tepe was for thousands of foragers belonging to different bands and tribes to cooperate over an extended period of time. Only a sophisticated religious and or ideological system could sustain such efforts. Gobekli Tepe held another sensational secret. For many years. Geneticists have been tracing the origins of domesticated wheat. Recent discoveries indicate that at least one domesticated variant in corn wheat originated in the Karakadug Hills, about 30 kilometers from Gobekli Tepe. This can hardly be a coincidence. It's likely that the cultural center of Göbekli Tepe was somehow connected to the initial domestication of wheat by humankind and of humankind by wheat. In order to feed the people who build and use the monumental structures, particularly large quantities of food were required. It may well be that foragers switched from gathering wild wheat to intense wheat cultivation, not to increase their normal food supply but rather to support the building and running of a temple. In the conventional picture, pioneers first built a village, and when it prospered they set up a temple in the middle. But Gobekli Tepe suggests that the temple may have been built first and that a village later grew up around. Victims of the revolution. The Faustian bargain between humans and grains was not the only deal our species made. Another deal was struck concerning the fate of animals such as sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens. Nomadic bands that stalked wild sheep gradually altered the constitutions of the herds on which they preyed. This process probably began with the selective hunting. Humans learned that it was to their advantage to hunt only adult lambs and old or sick sheep. They spared fertile females and young lambs in order to safeguard the long term vitality of the local herd. The second step might have been to actively defend the herd against predators, driving away lions, wolves, and rival human bands. The band might next have corralled the herd into a narrow gorge in order to better control and defend it. Finally, people began to make a more careful selection among the sheep in order to tailor them to human needs. The most aggressive rams, those mm, that showed the greatest resistance to human control were slaughtered first. So were the skinniest and the most inquisitive females. Shepherds are not fond of sheep whose curiosity takes them far from the herd. With each passing generation, the sheep became fatter, more submissive, and less curious. Voila! Mary had a little lamp, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamp was sure to go. So I'm counting pages. Okay, two more pages to go for this chapter. Chalo. Alternatively, hunters may have caught and adopted a lamb, fattening it during the months of plenty and slaughtering it in the leaner season. At some stage, they began keeping a greater number of such lambs. Some of these reached puberty and began to procreate. The most aggressive and unruly lambs were first to the slaughter. The most submissive and the most appealing lambs were allowed to live longer and procreate. The result was a herd of domesticated and submissive sheep. Such domesticated animals, sheep, chicken, donkeys, and other supplied food, meat, milk, eggs, raw materials, skin, wool, and muscle power. Transportation, logging, grinding, and other tasks hitherto performed by humans sinew were increasingly carried out by animals. In most farming societies, peoples focused on plant cultivation. Raising animals was a secondary activity, but a new kind of society also appeared in some places based primarily on the exploitation of animals, tribes of pastoralist herders. As humans spread around the world, so did their domesticated animals. 10,000 years ago, not more than a few million sheep. Today, the world sheep, cattle, boats, goats, and chickens lived in restricted Afro-Asian niches. Today, the world contains about a billion sheep, a billion pigs, more than a billion cattle, and more than 25 billion chickens, and they are all over the globe. The domesticated chicken is the most wide and the sheep are the second, third and fourth most widespread large mammals in the world. From a narrow evolutionary perspective which measures success by the number of DNA copies, the agricultural revolution was a wonderful boon for chickens, cattle, pigs and sheep. Unfortunately, the evolutionary perspective is an incomplete measure of success. It judges everything by the criteria of survival and reproduction with no regard for individual suffering and happiness. Domesticated chickens and cattle may well be an evolutionary success story, but they are also among the most miserable creatures that ever lived. Domestication of animals was found on a series of brutal practices that only became crueler with the passing of the centuries. The natural lifespan of wild chickens is about 7 to 12 years and of cattle about 20 to 25 years. In the wild, most chickens and cattle died long before that, but they still had a fair chance of living for a respectable in number of years. In contrast, the vast majority of domesticated chickens and cattle were slaughtered at the age of between a few weeks and few months. Because this has always been the optimal slaughtering age from an economic perspective, why keep feeding a cock for 3 years if it has already reached its maximum weight after 3 months? Egg-laying hens, dairy cows, and draught animals are sometimes allowed to live for many years, but the price is subjugation to a way of life completely alien to their urges and desires. It's reasonable to assume, for example, that bulls prefer to spend their days wandering over open prairies in the company of other bulls and cows rather than pulling carts and plowshares under the yoke of a whip wielding ape. In order to turn bulls, horses, donkeys, and camels into obedient draught animals, their natural instincts and social ties had to be broken, their aggression and sexuality contained, and their freedom of movement curtailed. Farmers developed techniques such as locking animals inside pens and cages, bridling them in harnesses and lashes, training them with whips and cattle prods, and and mutilating them. The process of taming almost always involves the castration of males. This restrains male aggression and enables humans selectively to control the herd's procreation. In many New Guinea societies, the wealth of a person has traditionally been determined by the number of pigs he or she owns. To ensure that the pigs can't run away, farmers in northern New Guinea slice off a chunk of each pig's nose. This causes severe pain whenever the pig tries to sniff. Since the pigs cannot find food or even find their way around without sniffing, this mutilation makes them completely dependent on their human owners. In another area of New Guinea, it has been customary to gouge out pigs' eyes so that they cannot even see where they are going. The dairy industry has its own ways of forcing animals to do its will. Cows, goats, and sheep produce milk only after giving birth to calves, kids, and lambs, and only as long as the youngsters are suckling. To continue a supply of animal milk, a farmer needs to have calves, kids, or lambs for suckling, but must prevent them from monopolizing the milk. One common method throughout history was so to simply slaughter the calves and kids shortly after birth, milk the mother for all she was worth, and then get her pregnant again. This is still a very widespread technique in many modern dairy farms. A milk cow usually lives for about 5 years before being slaughtered. During these 5 years, she is almost constantly pregnant and is fertilized within 60 to 120 days after giving birth in order to preserve maximum milk production. Her calves are separated from their from her shortly after birth. The females are reared to become the next generation of dairy cows, whereas the males are handed over to the care of meat industry. Another method is to keep the calves and kids near their mothers, but prevent them by various stratagems from suckling suckling too much uh, milk. The simplest way to do that is to allow the kid or calf to start suckling but drive it away once the milk starts flowing. This method usually encounters resistance from both kid and the mother. Some shepherds tribes used to kill the offspring, eat its flesh, and then stuff the skin. The stuffed offspring was then presented to the mother so that its presence would encourage her milk production. The newer tribe in Sudan went so far as to smear stuffed animals with their mother's urine to give the counterfeit calves a familiar live scent. Another newer technique was to tie a ring of thorns around the calf's mouth so that it pricks the mother and causes her to resist suckling. Tuareg camel breeders in the Sahara used to puncture or cut off parts of the nose and upper lip of young camels in order to make suckling painful, thereby discouraging them from consuming too much milk. Not all agricultural societies were this cruel to their farm animals. The lives of some domesticated animals could be quite good. Sheep raised for wool, pet dogs and cats, war horses and rat and race horses often enjoyed comfortable conditions. The Roman Emperor Caligula allegedly planned to appoint his favorite horse Incitatus to the consulship. Shepherds and farmers throughout history showed affection for their animals and have taken great care of them, just as many slave holders felt affection and concern for their slaves. It was no accident that kings and prophets styled themselves as shepherds and likened the way they and the gods cared for their people to a shepherd's care for his flock. Yet, from the viewpoint of the herd rather than that of the shepherd, it's hard to avoid the impression that for the vast majority of domesticated animals, the agricultural revolution was a terrible catastrophe. Their evolutionary success is meaningless. A rare wild rhinoceros on the brink of extinction is probably more satisfied than a calf who spent its short life inside a tiny box, flattened to produce juicy steaks. The contented rhinoceros is no less content for being among the last of its kind. The numerical success of the calf species is little consolation for the suffering of the individual endures. This discrepancy between evolutionary success and individual suffering is perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from the agricultural revolution. When we study the narrative of plants such as wheat and maize, maybe the purely evolutionary perspective makes sense. Yet, in the case of animals such as cattle, sheep, and sapiens, each with a complex world of sensations and emotions, we have to consider how evolutionary success translates into individual experience. In the following chapters, we will see time and again how a dramatic increase in the collective power and ostensible success of our species went hand in hand with much individual suffering.